You got, going on, buddy? On two? Yeah. Well, I was supposed to have a seat over there. I know. We had to give them away. But here, I'll give you some. Can you give two for us? Yeah.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks very much for coming. My name is Ian Bowles. I'm a senior fellow here in the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School. And on behalf of an impressive list of centers, I'd like to welcome you all tonight, including the Harvard University Center for the Environment, the Harvard College Republican Club, the Belfer Center, the Harvard College Environmental Action Committee, the Center for Business and Government, and of course the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee. So I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to a discussion of the Bush administration's policies on climate change, energy, and environmental issues. We're very fortunate tonight to have President Bush's chief environmental advisor here with us in Cambridge. These issues, as many of you know, are important, complicated, controversial. I'd like to add on a personal note that to thank Jim for taking so much time out of his busy day to come all the way up here and join us. He's actually headed back tonight down to Washington. I came to know Jim myself during the transition between my service in the Clinton White House, where I worked on these similar issues, and Jim team coming in. So it's a privilege to have you here, Jim. Before saying a word about Jim's background, let me just add a program note. Jim's going to give remarks. And then our second speaker, Rosina Beerbaum, is going to come up and give remarks. We'll have a brief discussion and then open it up to questions from the floor. Let me tell you about Jim Connaughton's background before I turn it over to him. He was unanimously confirmed by the U.S. Senate to be the chair of the White House Council on Environmental Quality on June 14. In this capacity, he serves as a senior environmental advisor to the president. He oversees the White House Office of Environmental Policy, which coordinates and oversees the development of federal environmental policy, interagency implementation of environmental programs, and he also mediates disagreements, which are many, I can tell you from having served down there, between federal agencies, tribal, and local governments. Prior to joining the Bush administration, Mr. Connaughton was a partner at the law firm of Sibley and Austin and its environmental practice group. Let me just say in conclusion that Jim is a Yale graduate, and when I invited him to come up, he said that we were getting up here at Harvard before Yale was, and that he was going to get a hard time about that. So with that, let me invite Jim to come on up to the podium. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ian, for that kind introduction, and it's a real privilege for me to be here with this group. It's a privilege for me to be on a panel with Dean Rosenbaum, Beerbaum, excuse me. Got Rosenbaum on the brain. Especially for this panel, I'm really delighted that you're able to fill in, because the climate issue that we'll talk about today, and then the assorted other issues that I'll try to fold in, the comprehensiveness of their scope and the continuity of these issues. You know, to go from one administration to another, like so much else in our political world, 85% of it is non-political, and it's about getting it through and getting it done. You know, there's always a political overlay to it, but I can't tell you the number of things that I have inherited from the prior administration to fulfill and I hope to actually leave a similar legacy when I'm done in my term here. These issues are here. They're here for the long term. They require collective action. So that's why in particular I was delighted that you were able to fill in Dean Bierbaum. I would note that I was sorry that Dr. Holdren couldn't be with us because I have read his stuff, and it's always fun to quote people back to themselves. So I'll try to keep that to a minimum. Where I want to start is with the general concept, and it's the concept that President Bush articulated on February 14th. It is, America and the world share this common goal. We must foster economic growth in ways that protect our environment. We must encourage growth that will provide a better life for citizens while protecting the land, the water, and the air that sustain life. The reason I wanted to start with that quote is there's a nuance to it that I think is important as we look out, not just in the next several years, but as we look out over the next century. I think we've had the common expression of, we can improve the environment while protecting our economy. There's the notion of we can do one and the other, but that somehow they're one or the other and they sort of go alongside each other. The nuance here is it is actually by promoting our economic activity, by integrating our values into the promotion of that economic activity, that we actually provide for ourselves an even more enhanced quality of life that comes with the recreational values we're able to enjoy, the air pollution reductions we've now enabled ourselves to enjoy, the incredible improvements in our water quality, all of these things that give us the freedom and the flexibility to pursue our passions and enjoy the environment in which we live, they actually come from this sustained economic foundation. But it's economic with values. And I think that's where really when we start talking about issues such as climate change, or we start talking about issues such as worldwide global development, when we talk about the next stage of how we both regulate but also how we incentivize continual environmental improvement and diminish natural resource degradation, it is that overarching philosophy that really drives this. So let me start with climate change. I would start with a bit of a pitch. I would invite all of you to go to www.whitehouse.gov and actually, you're all students or your teachers, pull the paper. So I've got the paper. Pull the policy book and read it. I'm going to give you an overview today. But this is another theme I want to note. The key to these policy issues is actually to understand the policy. And to have a good old-fashioned policy debate. And our effort in all of these areas is to try to get us into the policy dialogue and have it out there rather than on the political plane. And that's really why these kinds of conferences are important. We all recognize the seriousness of climate change. The science has gotten us to a point where we know we must commit real resources, both financial and good old-fashioned brain power, to understanding what we're looking at, to understanding its implications, and to understanding what we can do about it. And certainly the U.S. commitment started in the first Bush administration, carried through the Clinton administration, and sustained in our administration is unparalleled around the world. Whether it's the science effort, the technology effort, or the kind of effort that we're engaged in here in terms of really thinking through the policy implications of what we face and what we can do about it, no one comes close to the United States of America. Now, to move forward, it's a long-term challenge. We have to understand what we can accomplish near-term and what that can do to build the foundation for what we can do long-term. As you're all aware, we do not support in the Bush administration the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. And we largely do not support it because we feel it was an anti-growth approach. The option provided to America under that treaty was an option that was economically constraining, was capital constraining, and therefore was technology development constraining. It would require drastic short-term action, would have cost significant jobs under the targets that were set with Kyoto. Now, to say we cannot do Kyoto, we won't do Kyoto, is not to say that we shouldn't be moving forward quite aggressively with responding to the issue of climate change. They are, in fact, two distinct issues. And it is there that the President Bush announced on February 14th our strategy for how the course we wanted to chart for the United States of America, but also the course that would set the foundation for a new conversation internationally. It begins with measuring our progress on climate change the way we measure our progress in most other aspects of our life. It's sort of the efficiency of our activity. That's one way of looking at it, or getting the greatest benefits out of the effort we put into something. That is why we've articulated the effort in terms of greenhouse gas intensity. And we've set a national goal for ourselves. Greenhouse gas intensity is how many greenhouse gases we put out for every $1 million of gross domestic product. It's an efficiency metric. Standing here today, we put out 183 carbon equivalent tons of greenhouse gases, for every $1 million of GDP. The President has set a national goal by 2012 of reducing that number to 151 tons. Okay, so it's becoming more efficient. We have more economic output, less greenhouse gases. This 18% reduction, it amounts to an 18% reduction in the intensity, or an 18% improvement in our efficiency, if you want to look at it, is going to be hard to do. Our best analysis by the Energy Information Administration projects that if we continue with the same robust level of investment, innovation, individual action, the best we could squeeze out, and a whole bunch of new policies, the best we could squeeze out is a 14% improvement. What we have set for ourselves is 18%. It's reasonably ambitious, and therefore we believe is sufficiently attractive that we can mobilize the economic forces to actually pull it off. And so that is the way we're going to measure ourselves. That's the approach we want to hold out there. And what that enables us to do is put us on a path towards slowing, and then, as science justifies, stopping, and then reversing our greenhouse gas emissions. But on any long-term challenge, one of the core goal for us and also for the rest of the world is if we can get everyone on a path to slow the growth in emissions, we will do more in this next decade than sort of an unrealistic path of getting a small number of actors to try to reverse their emissions. And so we think the area here is for collective action towards slowing the growth of emissions, which, if you know anything at all about the greenhouse gas issue, is quite consequential, because greenhouse gases matter in terms of their cumulative buildup over the next 100 years. So it's a question of how many greenhouse gases we can take out of the system now. It's not a question of, collectively, it's not a question of what any individual actor does in terms of either reversing or not. So we can make real progress in terms of reducing the overall cumulative impact. Now, we are proceeding with 3 pillars of action. The first is science. We got to keep focused on the science. Second is technology. It is recognized that with economic growth, with technology innovation, that is the only way out of this if you want to pursue a growth-oriented strategy. The other strategy is to just turn everything off. Okay, so you have 2 paths. One is growth, one is not growth. Technology is what's going to keep us moving forward. And what we announced on February 14th and followed up on was a broad range of domestic and international policy tools that are going to support each of these pillars, and I'll highlight those for you right now. In the science and tech area, we have a combined budget of, I think, $4.6 billion. That's a $700 million increase. It's both research activities, technology investment and deployment, and a whole suite of incentives. In fact, a quite comprehensive suite of incentives to promote the kinds of technologies that we all read about and we're all interested in deploying, and well, we're putting real money on the table to encourage that, such as buying advanced hybrid vehicles, such as creating an incentive for those fuel cell vehicles that we're all interested in. That commitment, again, is unparalleled elsewhere in the world, and it's quite real. And it's a sustained effort that's been carried forward from one administration to the next. We've upped it a lot, but again, this is a substantial effort. What we've also done, in addition to just funding, is we've got a new structure for managing science and technology. We recognize that we have the scientists going on one path and the technologists going on another path, but as we try to look at this from a policy perspective, it's very important to get the science and the technology people together so that we can be understanding our technology needs and the science that needs to support that. Again, that effort was started, and we're going to continually improve that process, and it's a cabinet level group that's going to integrate our science and technology management policy. In the area of mitigation, what we can do about it, we have a whole series of new strategies, and we'll be adding to them as we go along, because this is a process that requires continual focus and attention. In addition to the sort of technology advancement and deployment dollars I talked about, the tax credit approach, the incentives for the purchase of things like advanced fuel cell cars or for renewable energy or the like, we have a $500 million down payment for the next budget cycle on what is a $4.6 billion commitment over the next 5 years for all of these incentives. In addition to the incentives, we recognize that we actually need a better catalog, and we need to encourage our economic actors to step forward, having been on the sidelines for much of the last decade, to step forward and participate in what we think will be a much more effective registry process by which companies can come forward, register their emissions, and then get credit for the reductions that they make. And we are basically proposing to develop the baseline infrastructure for whatever a future set of programs might require, whether it's an incentive-based system through tax incentives, whether it's a good old-fashioned command and control regulatory approach, or whether it's a more market-based regulatory approach. We feel it's important to take the next step in creating a registry of greenhouse gas emission reductions and letting the economic actors know that if they come forward today and they make real reductions today, we're going to give them credit that will be recognized in conjunction with future policy measures. We think that's a very good way of attracting them forward, but also it puts us in a situation where we can again participate and and promote our leadership in setting the rules, the accounting rules for how we measure and verify greenhouse gas emission reductions, which, by the way, guess what? There's no harmonization of that right now around the world. And so this is a key place where we can contribute, and it's important because we've got the real know-how to do that. We're going to review our progress as we go along, and we've made clear to at least our U.S. community that we've set a goal for ourselves now, and it's a tangible goal, it's a concrete goal, and if we're not making progress toward meeting the goal, the President has indicated quite squarely that we will consider additional measures beyond those we have on the table. I won't go into the whole suite of initiatives. There's over 80 of them. They're going to be coming out in a report in the next few weeks. I want to highlight a few sort of top-tier ones, and this will sort of give you a feel for our philosophy as we move forward. One, we're going to begin to strike a series of voluntary sector agreements, where we're going to try to get sectors to make commitments, set targets for themselves for their reductions. We hope to get those agreements in place. There are several already in place, and then we hope that will encourage them to participate in this registry and create sort of a trading market for the reductions they're going to do. So that's sort of on the voluntary promotion side of things. We also have quite a substantial investment, political capital investment, in seeing a very, very robust conservation title to the Farm Bill. This is probably something you haven't read about, but it's a core component of our overall strategy. We are looking at more than a doubling of the subsidies that will go to farmers to engage in conservation activities on their working lands. Again, this is an incentive-based approach. We're talking more than $3 billion a year over the next 10 years that will give these farmers the opportunity personally to exercise stewardship and engage in the kind of practices that will lead to significant sequestration opportunities, including reforestation of lands that currently are being used for agricultural production. We see this as a wonderful opportunity to incentivize, literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans, not just toward the goal of conservation, but toward the goal of improving our water systems that they all reside along, and our goal of sequestering carbon. In addition, we've got new efforts in the transportation area. We have phased out the government, or we're phasing out the government support for advanced hybrid vehicles. We really think the private sector has now taken that on. We're seeing hybrid vehicles hit the market, and we're transferring that money into the higher risk but greater yield area of fuel cell technology, not just with respect to transportation, but also with respect to energy supply. It's a very exciting area. The promise is quite high. The technical obstacles, and I'm sure Dean Bierbaum has worked very closely on these issues. There's still some significant technical obstacles, and it's really going to take some lifting by the government, in addition to the private sector, to help overcome some of those obstacles. But it's incredibly exciting. On the international side of things, in addition to building on the tropical forest conservation initiatives, for which we have tens of millions of dollars going to countries to help them both preserve and, again, reconstruct their forestry activities, we have, as part of our overall development agenda, a real commitment toward advancing the cause of clean energy in the developing world from the village to the metropolis, of advancing the cause of agricultural productivity, which will lead to substantial reforestation and prevent the deforestation that's going on today as more and more land is put into what is often fairly unproductive agricultural production. And then with that effort, we then have some sustainable forest initiatives that we'll be coming out with. One key component of which is let's stop illegal logging. There's tremendous amounts of illegal logging around the world, and we are dedicated to a very significant and concrete effort to put a halt to that, which is a very good place to start because that's a place where we can get real developing country partnerships going. In our view, this is a responsible but a measured approach, and we think it's an approach that, because it is measured, has the capacity not only to attract much greater participation within our country, but we also think it has the capability of attracting a new conversation with the developing world, one that can be incentive-based, one by which we can create partnerships toward further progress. In that regard, we have the World Summit on Sustainable Development coming up in Johannesburg at the end of this summer. We are looking at development, if you've been following, if you followed the Monterey Conference, the recent Monterey Conference, we actually have an integrated development policy by which we're promoting the cause of good governance, without which you cannot have the kinds of legal structures by which you can promote environmental protection and prevent natural resource degradation. We're supporting the cause of economic stability, creating an economic environment where you can attract the capital for the long term. As we all know, when you invest for the long term, you're investing for your children. If you're in an environment that's politically unstable and economically irrational, you tend to invest for the short term, which tends to cause pollution and tends to degrade our natural resources. And so our development approach and our philosophy is to create the maximum opportunity for the kinds of investments. So it's not just aid, although the President committed a substantial new chunk of money to aid, many billions of dollars over what our current foreign aid is, but it's actually attracting that 10 times quotient of private direct investment. For every dollar of aid, there's 10 times as much private investment. I have a philosophy of follow the money. If we can harness the power of that private investment towards sustainable activities, we will do much more than any aid package can produce. Aid tends to be project-based. Investment is for the long term. With that, I think I'll close with just to convey to you just my role in this process. I'm both on climate, the World Summit, and some of the other issues that we could talk about in the Q&A. This cabinet is quite personally committed to these issues. I mean, I've had the rare privilege of being involved in over a dozen cabinet-level meetings where you have Secretary Powell, Secretary O'Neill, Secretary Norton, Secretary Evans, Administrator Whitman, sitting around a table committing serious cabinet-level time because they are personally committed to these subjects. It's been a rare privilege, and that's going to continue. So it's not just the money. It's not just the policy, it's actually the personal commitment to seeing further progress in this area, and we're going to be carrying that forward. So I look forward to your questions. I look forward to hearing Dean Bierbaum's remarks, and thank you again for including me in this dialogue.
Thanks very much, Jim. That was terrific. Before we go to some questions, we're going to ask Rosina Beerbaum to come up and give a short response and some comments on Jim's remarks. Rosina Beerbaum is Dean of the School of Natural Resources at the University of Michigan. She has a long track record in these environmental issues. I'll just mention one other resume note for her before turning it over to her, and that is that she served in the White House Science Office in the Clinton administration, where she was head of the environmental division of the Science Office, the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So she has a lot of experience in all this, and we welcome her here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's my job to be provocateur, so I guess we don't end up praising Caesar completely. Let me start with an old adage that if you don't change direction, you're going to end up where you're headed. And in terms of CO2 emissions, I think it's important to stand back and see the big picture that already today they're higher than they were for the last 420,000 years on this planet. And over the next 100 years, if we stay, the world stays on a business as usual path, we'll take the concentrations to levels that haven't been seen for 50 million years, a time when the Earth was a very different place. So I would argue the next 100 years are extremely important, and every ton of CO2 that goes up today stays there for 100 years. I think it is very exciting that the President wants to accelerate progress on climate change on both the research side and the incentive side, and that's very much welcome. The U.S. is, in fact, the largest spender in terms of R&D research, so in terms of science R&D for climate, and so the additional $40 million that's been put into the Climate Change Research Initiative will make a difference. However, $40 million out of the $2 billion that we spend is relatively small in terms of an added increment. It's focused on areas where we can make quick improvements in science, and that's very good and very important. It's focused on modeling, on observations, on aerosols, and on the North American carbon budget, a very important question. I'm concerned, however, though, by continuing to focus on the physical climate side, we might lose some of the very important questions that global change, which is really the term of the program that the first President Bush and the Congress created in 1989. Global change is broader than climate change and talks also about land productivity and ocean and water resources and ecological systems and the capacity of the Earth to sustain life. It was really in the late 80s, in the early days of the program, appropriate to focus on the physical climate system because the question was, is climate changing? If you look at the evolution of the science commentary over the years, we moved from 1990, where we said the degree change could be natural, might not be, to 1995, when the scientists said, hey, there's a discernible human influence on the climate system, to now 2001, the report produced actually Inauguration Day, when the scientists said most of the warming in the last 50 years is due to human activities. So the questions the scientists are saying we need to focus on now are not, is climate changing, but so what, and what does it mean? What kind of gain or pain is it going to cause to society? And so the Global Change Research Program has been trying to evolve from a climate change program into a global change program and begin to ask these very central questions of what does it mean to me in my region? What are the socioeconomic impacts? Can we do assessments of climate change? The Pacific Northwest, for example, through the national assessment, which was completed in the last days of the Clinton administration, showed with earlier snow melts and changing water patterns and the requirement for hydro and the requirement for salmon and the potential growth of the Pacific Northwest, there wasn't going to be enough water for all of these issues. And unless you look in a particular place about how the overlay of climate affects everything else going on there, all the other environment and socioeconomic stresses, I don't think we'll be able to adapt, which is clearly something we're going to have to do as well as mitigate. So let me turn to the issue of mitigation and energy and setting goals. I think it's very important to set a stretch goal. And George Bernard Shaw once said, the sign of an educated person is if they are emotionally moved by statistics. So let me very quickly give you some, and I expect in this audience some real pathos. But the emissions, the improvement per dollar of GDP that Jim talked about will still lead to a net increase in total emissions. So it's an improvement in a rate, but it's not an improvement in the total. And so what the U.S. would have promised had they agreed to Kyoto was by 2012, our emissions would be 7% below 1990 levels. And now Our new goal says we will only be 30% above 1990 levels. And the statistics part of this, if you're facing a world of 10 billion people in 100 years, and you can have 10 billion tons of carbon to stop the planet at 2 times pre-industrial CO2, or 550 parts per million, that means 1 ton a person. The US uses 5 tons a person. If you were to go to an emissions per person for CO2 as one of the nominees for the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Dr. Pachauri wants, the U.S. would have to reduce its emissions by 80% from today's levels, not grow an additional 30%. So the numbers are very difficult to work out. The inexorability and the time lags in the system make urgency on these centennial problems very real. So in terms of the energy budget, if Dr. Holdren were here, he would have told you the PCAST report, which is the President's Committee of Advisors on Science and Technology, claimed that we were not putting nearly enough money into certain parts of the energy sector, and those with the most leverage, given everything else happening in the public sector, would be efficiency and renewables. President Bush has increased monies in these areas, although by the last count, we're still about $300 million below the recommended levels for energy efficiency, and about $200 million below for where renewable energy should be. I think that the moving towards a hydrogen economy is a very exciting thing, but both GM and Ford have said it's really important somebody starts thinking about the infrastructure necessary should we be able to produce these cars in a timely fashion. So let me just stop so we can have your questions and just say that I think a journey of 1,000 miles has to start with the first step. And I think that's what Kyoto was meant to be, a first step, not a perfect first step. It very much bore the architecture of the United States. The United States was deemed very brown, not green, in the construction of Kyoto, in that we asked for all gases for a 5-year averaging period and maximum trading to reduce costs. It was a stretch goal, but I think setting a goal is a very important first step to get the rest of the world to begin to participate. And as you know, we can't stabilize the atmosphere unless the entire world participates. So let me stop and say I think it's the goal of the role of the government to be visionary, and in terms of climate change research, I think that means encompassing global change, and in terms of an energy policy, I think it means greatly increasing energy efficiency and renewable dollars, and setting a stretch goal to greatly actually reduce our emissions as opposed to growing more slowly. Thanks.
Okay, Rosina, thank you very much. Before we open up to the floor, let me just ask one question to get the ball rolling in discussion front, and let me ask Jim Connaughton. The rub of this issue in my analysis is whether or not we're going to take mandatory or voluntary incentive-based policies in this area, and it's a debate that raged in the Clinton administration. We thought about the utility sector and the transportation sector. What is your judgment? Does the science of climate change warrant mandatory measures to this stage, or are we safe to stay with voluntary measures?
Well, the reality is today in the United States, we actually rely on a combination of regulatory measures, mandatory regulatory measures, voluntary measures, and incentives. That's the reality today. I could give you the list of regulatory programs that we've got, whether it's current CAFE, whether it's our energy efficiency standards or what have you, without which we'd be even potentially be in worse shape in terms of the increase. And so there already are a suite of measures. So I don't want to be in a position of, the question is further mandatory measures of some different scale or dimension. I think that's really what the question is. And I think right now, at least in our judgment, we have more of those coming along. We're about to initiate new rulemakings on CAFE. We have additional rulemakings in the energy efficiency area. All of that regulatory activity will continue. So we have those tools. But we're really trying to tap into is the power of incentives in terms of where we want to take the focus is in this next period, the additional power of incentives and the additional power really of getting commitments from the sectors, again, as I said, that have been standing, they were sitting on the sideline waiting to see where the policy is going to shape up. And a key component of that was the uncertainty, given the fact the Senate had rejected Kyoto as constructed, was the uncertainty of what would happen next. And I think, again, in our view, we filled the void. Some like it, some don't like it. I think the key was to articulate something around which people can now make some planning decisions. That's the key to getting people involved. And I think that's more important than, in fact, where you set the target or anything else. It's just getting some certainty into what the policy direction will be.
Rosina, any comment before we open up for questions?
Yeah, well, one thought on that. I think you need a combination of policy instruments all moving in the same direction to get maximum movement. And there's very little retrospective analysis on this from the 70s in terms of the energy crises. But if you look at California, where you clearly have the advantage of regulation and incentives, they have, over the last 25 years, kept their energy use to 7,000 kilowatt hours per person, whereas the rest of the country has grown 30% on average. If the whole country had done as California did with their very strong regulatory and incentive program, we would have saved 11 ANWRs, or Arctic Wildlife Nature Refuges. So there's very powerful possibilities in situations like California.
Thank you both. We have 4 mics here in the audience, two in the front and 2 up on the stage. So if you could follow 3 simple rules in asking your questions. 1 is to introduce yourself, identify yourself. 2nd, please be brief, less than a minute. And 3rd, when you ask a question, please ask a question and form it, end your sentence with a question. So thank you. Ma'am.
Grammatical.
Thank you very much. My name is Dr. Rabinovitz. I'm a member of Parliament from South Africa. I've already participated in one conference before the Johannesburg Summit and will in another one when I go back. And my question is, Kyoto, the response of the United States to Kyoto, for a variety of reasons, didn't gain the country very good international relations. Certainly not in the developing world. And although it's a very good idea to insist on good governance and economic stability and to provide aid of a sort, there are positive initiatives that were in Kyoto, and I'd like to know what steps the government is taking to highlight those positive initiatives and to put them on the table before the Johannesburg summit starts, so that we improve the political climate, so that there's not another failure there, in the form of such things as partnerships in R&D and in capacity building and in real promotion of development, so that we can look at a world change in climate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Why don't I direct that to Jim, since he's in charge these days, I have to say.
I think your point is very important. We need to actually, we've begun to articulate the potential partnerships available, and I think as the conversation is going toward Johannesburg, I feel it's going in a positive direction, which is partnerships for action. And so that is where we are framing up. Again, it started with the President's announcement in Monterey, which I think has begun to shift the international dialogue in a very positive way. And I think building on that, we are looking for Johannesburg to focus on true partnerships with real commitments of all of society, government, NGO community, the private sector, and then partnerships, developing world, north-south, around water, right? Delivering clean, safe, drinkable water so that we can stop, the tragedy of millions of children dying every year from lack of access to it. Around energy, clean, reliable energy, and again, it's not just solar panels in the villages, it's how do we get a structure in the urban areas where they have baseload generation and get the kind of investment toward clean technologies there. I mentioned agriculture, sustainable forestry, health. We have some core areas, but our goal is to forge partnerships, is to get beyond the rhetoric and actually talk about partnerships that deliver results. And so I'm encouraged for those further conversations, and I feel encouraged with the reception of many of our international partners to that philosophy.
Thank you, Jim. Ma'am, over here in the front mic.
Yes, hi, my name is Elizabeth Wilmot. I'm a first year here at the Kennedy School. I recently moved back from China, where I was working on environmental policy, and I was a student of John Holdren's last semester in an energy policy class. However, my question is actually not related to science. While that does concern me, and I do have quite a few questions, but they mostly came up when I was watching the Enron hearings. So, in any case, I would like to know, and I thank you for coming. I would like to know how you see the Kyoto Protocol as a general step in international policy making. You did address this in your last question somewhat, but I would like to know if you see this as a trend of part of a trend of isolationism in regards to perhaps a rejection of further negotiations on an actual international treaty with other countries.
Jim, why don't we take that question and ask you whether split it in half and say, how do you respond to the criticism of the administration that it hasn't participated in some of the international treaties, for one, and for two, I think this is part of the question before, is part of the criticism of the administration in the Kyoto Protocol was that it abandoned it without being seen as putting forward a workable alternative. So I thought I might take the prerogative to divide those questions and put them back over to you.
First, it's not a question about aversion to international treaties. In fact, just today, Governor Whitman was up on the Hill forwarding our legislation to implement and seeking ratification of the POPs Treaty, persistent organic pollutants, that will control the 12 most consequential pollutants that we have to deal with around the world, and then 2 additional treaties that relate to chemical and hazardous substances. Where these multilateral agreements make sense, and are implementable, we're not going to shy away from proceeding with them, and we've had a leadership role in those treaties, and we're making them happen. So the question is vehicles, which goes back to your question, Kyoto. The Kyoto effort was an important one for bringing all of the countries of the world around towards saying, how can we get some action on the UN FCCC commitment, the United Framework Convention commitment? So it was important. The U.S. maintained a leadership role in those discussions, and I would note, even notwithstanding the fact that we've made clear we're not going to ratify Kyoto, we have maintained the level of participation in the Kyoto dialogue. We have continued to maintain our role with the umbrella group that we work with of some of our allies, and we have contributed quite constructively to the discussions on the trading mechanisms and all the other components of Kyoto, including the measurement issues. We've not pulled back a jot from that, because this conversation is going to go on for many decades. And our goal is actually to try to get more active engagement from many of the parties that have been sort of under the Kyoto structure, who have been content to sort of stand on the sidelines. The Senate directed that, bipartisan, in 1997. We have to engage all countries, not just a select few. And that's why, to go to then unilateralism, we've tried to articulate a set of policies that we think will be attractive, a basis for conversation on a greater multilateral scale. I think one indication of that is, as soon as we articulated our policy, we began to get phone calls from countries that had not been talking to us about these issues, wanting to start to talk seriously about components of what we proposed. We also tried to construct this in a way where we would continue to have a role to contribute to the Kyoto discussions, especially in the area of measurement and verification, because that's the bedrock of all of this. You can't have the kind of Kyoto trading mechanisms without a bedrock of measurement and verification. So with all of that, I mean, where I sit in terms of where I started and where we are today, our international engagement has only increased, not diminished. And with what the President announced in Monterey, it will only increase even more substantially.
Thank you.
Let me just, before we turn to the next question, ask Rosina to hop in here. Rosina, the Bush administration has put forward a lot of criticism of the Kyoto Protocol. What's good about the Kyoto Protocol, or why would someone take a different view?
Well, I think what's good about it is what I was saying at the end of my 5 minutes was that the way it was built allowed maximum flexibility in terms of trading, so that you could get the cheapest ton of carbon wherever you could to reduce it, and the atmosphere would still see a ton of carbon come out of it. You could include terrestrial sinks in it, which, as we know, is going to be quite a boon for the U.S. depending on how you counted those sinks. We included all greenhouse gases, so you could trade off several, depending again on the cost and who had them. It was as maximally flexible, I think, as the international community could structure over the 5 years they agonized about it. It allowed a learning process, too, so that each commitment period, averaged 5 years, as I said, would be thought about then before the next commitment period. And if new science came in, one would hope they'd incorporate that new science into the new goal and target for the subsequent year.
Thank you for that. Let me go up here to the, up above there.
Yeah, I'm a second-year student in the college. My question is a little more about the philosophy of the administration with regards to conservation. Dick Cheney's made some remarks that suggest that the mentality of the U.S., it's in the nature of Americans to be big and to consume a lot, and that we have to be careful about that. We need to respect that. Last week or 2 weeks ago, Trent Lott held up a picture in Congress of a European minicar to suggest that we don't want to be like them. They were discussing mileage standards. And this concerns me a little bit because I feel like this is a big obstacle in moving in the direction towards conservation. Could you discuss how we can overcome this obstacle or work with it, or what your thoughts are on it? Thanks.
Jim?
Yeah, our climate policy, our energy policy, our agricultural policy have a lot of moving parts. And to make progress, we actually have to go after all of our opportunities. And specifically when it comes to energy, we need, our population is growing, our economy is growing, we need new energy. And to get there in a way that both contributes to our climate policy of trying to reduce our emissions, to get there in a way that's going to promote greater efficiency, we have to look at all available tools, of which conservation is a critical component, of which promoting efficiency is a critical component, of which advancing renewable energy is a critical component, and in which creating a new opportunity, which I know Dr. Holdren has dedicated a lot of his work to, a greater opportunity to both maintain our nuclear fleet, but potentially enhance it, add to it. I don't think the prospects for significant additions are not great, but some modest additions are there. We have to look at that whole equation toward meeting these challenges. And so I personally wouldn't diminish any of them. They're all critically important. And I think as we've had this national dialogue on energy, they are all squarely on the table, and there's quite consequential policy both between with the administration and the Congress in each of those areas to advance them. That's the only way forward, and we have to go after them all with vigor.
Rosina, what's the prospect for major technological innovation in energy, more conservation, newer technologies to help address these problems?
I think it's quite clear that that hydrogen offers a very exciting and tantalizing solution in something like a 2 to 3 decade time frame. But I would point out that if you allow growth to continue very steeply, you'll have to fill that very big demand 3 decades out with more of the technology you're producing. So I think there's an important role for energy efficiency and renewables, off-the-shelf technologies. We have technologies that can produce 50-mile-per-gallon cars and 70-mile-per-gallon cars. As you said, it's more of a will of the people or non-will of the people. I think it's important to use as much as you can of the existing technologies to damp demand while trying to do the revolutionary change, and I think it's the role of the government to do both.
Over here.
Yes, hi, my name is Peter Frumhoff. I'm the Director and Senior Scientist of the Global Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists based here in Cambridge. I have a question for Mr. Connaughton following up on his comments about the Bush administration's commitment to strong climate science. Next week in Geneva, the U.S. and other governments are getting together to decide on the next chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, currently held by Dr. Robert Watson, a U.S. citizen. There's been strong sense in the climate science community that that chair should be held by somebody with very strong atmospheric science credentials and strong management skills, and that many scientists, including Ralph Cicerone, the head of the Bush administration's requested National Academy panel on climate, have strongly supported the renomination of Dr. Watson to that important, perhaps most important in the scientific community position. The U.S. chose not to support or not to put forward his nomination, but other governments have. And so there'll be a decision next week about who will be chairing that most important scientific panel on climate change. My question is, given the strong support from other governments, both industrialized and developing country governments, for Dr. Watson, as well as strong support from the climate science community, should a majority of other governments vote to support Dr. Watson, would the U.S. oppose that either as the chair or the co-chair of that panel?
Let me just say before you answer that Jim answered a related question in our meeting upstairs with a bunch of students, and so I've heard a little bit before, but it hasn't been phrased in terms of the diplomatic piece, the majority of government. So,
Yeah, what's been missing from the information flow is we actually nominated in February a very distinguished and accomplished atmospheric scientist, Dr. Susan Solomon, to chair the work group. There are 3 work groups. One of which is the work group on science, which is the critical work group. Dr. Susan Solomon is one of the leading, she's a NOAA scientist, she's an American, she's one of the leading figures in the whole ozone depletion area. We thought it was important, given the fact that the majority of the investment in science is US dollars, that it would be very critical for us, because science is critical, to get the chairmanship of that working group for the first time. Okay, so that's where we wanted to use our American spot. And I don't know if you know Susan Solomon, but I invite you to check her out. If you don't know her, she's fabulous. And so that's what we chose to do on the atmospheric science piece. And by the way, she'll be the first woman chair in the IPCC process, which right now is kind of a men's club. And so I think it's important to draw that out as well. With respect to the chair of the overall effort, a European chair for the first period, 5 or 6 years. We had Dr. Robert Watson, who was quite accomplished. I wouldn't disagree with that. He's been a leader in this area, and he's carried the chairmanship for this period. We thought, as a matter of our overall commitment to engaging the developing world, when India approached us and asked if we would support Dr. Pachauri, we saw that as a very significant diplomatic overture. And given the fact that we were really pushing hard to get the chairmanship of the actual operating committee on science, we thought it would be quite useful, not just diplomatically US and India, but we thought it would be quite useful for the IPCC to let a developing country have a lead on this subject. As you may know, Dr. Pachauri has not shrunk from archly criticizing the US and its policies, so that's, those considerations are not what was driving our decision. We thought the IPCC is a very robust, effective institution. I think having a new chair, as we had one, we had another, having another is not going to affect its work in one way or the other. In fact, again, I think the diplomatic imperative here is to get some engagement. When developing countries want to come forward like that, we should be encouraging that and promoting it.
Rosina Beerbaum headed the U.S. delegation to at least some of the negotiations of the IPCC.
Yep,
Any comment?
Yeah, the U.S. has always chaired one of the 3 working groups, whether or not we've had a chair of the overall committee. And in fact, I'm not completely unbiased, because I on behalf of the United States, nominated Bob Watson to be the chair. Bert Bohlin, who is the European first chair of the IPCC, served 2 terms, 12 years, and it was the expectation that Bob Watson might also serve 2 terms, 12 years. That's certainly what the science community was expecting. So the fact that we nominated Susan Solomon to chair Working Group 1, when we've also had Jim McCarthy of this own institution here chairing Working Group 2 previously, I think it doesn't really matter. I think the question is, do you want a scientist to run it, or do you want a non-scientist to run it? And at least my opinion is that this is the premier science entity in the world, and it ought to be a scientist. I have nothing against Pachauri. I think he's a wonderful energy expert, but I don't think that's what the IPCC is about.
Up here on the upper left.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for coming. My name is Nat Myers. I'm a sophomore at the college, and I was very glad to hear that you're concerned about deforestation. I grew up in Indonesia, where deforestation is such a problem, and illegal logging in particular, especially in Kalimantan, that a lot of local groups have taken towards tree spiking. And my question is what your thoughts are on spiking trees, and in particular what the Bush administration policy is on supporting groups that spike trees.
Tree spiking, Jim.
Tree spiking, I don't support it. I think it's an act of violence, and you injure people. So I don't support tree spiking. I do support good, effective policies and good, effective policing of illegal logging, and that's what we're going to try to achieve with the various programs we're going to roll out. We've got a lot of engagement on this issue. We have the technology that we can deploy in terms of providing real-time remote sensing capability. Right now, we've been relying on 4 to 6 week lags. We can actually speed that up and give local enforcers and help build capacity by which they can actually track poachers real time. We think it's that kind of thing that's going to lead to that, coupled with much greater promotion of sustainable forest management practices and getting the private sector. They've got a competitive interest in this, getting them engaged. That will do more to prevent deforestation than acts of violence.
Let me just make the moderator's prerogative to say that I think the Clinton administration shared that view on tree spiking. Over here.
Hi, my name is Andy Frank. I'm a freshman at the college. I first want to thank both of you for coming. It's an honor. My question has to do, in the 1970s with the energy shortage and everything, a lot of countries had to be more efficient, and that went over to the 80s. We had a much more efficient, less waste, and therefore less pollution. But the economy was still strong. I mean, I'm sure Republicans would argue that it was stronger than in the 70s. My question is, conservatives and Republicans generally are very in favor of welfare reform, and something where, if someone is dependent on something, the way to get them, not dependent on them is not to give them more of that, or to, like welfare reform, kind of like make them go to work, make them, kind of learn to fish by themselves. My question is, why can't the businesses that are dependent on this oil that need to that need this oil, why isn't it one of those things where you can take it away, or maybe, obviously gradually there's different ways to do that, but why is the philosophy one where we can't take away this energy at all for fear of economic consequences when they can learn, they have learned that they can do without?
Let me just ask you, are you suggesting that equating subsidies for the oil industry with welfare subsidies? Or let me draw out your question, so I'm sure I understand it either.
Yeah, subsidies for the oil company in terms of like energy production.
Well, let's mix up the response a minute and let's start with Rosina. Rosina, any comments about subsidies, differences between the past administration and current administration?
Well, I'm not sure I can talk about how they've changed over time. I mean, I think it is very clear that for a very long time there have been kind of hidden energy subsidies that have been very hard to disentangle. And where you begin to count them and where you end it, like, in terms of coal miner black lung disease support and all, is very hard. But it's quite clear there is a mountain of subsidy for fossil fuel and nuclear industry folks, and not nearly the kind of support for renewables. And certainly not for efficiency either, but I can't really comment more deeply than that.
Jim?
Yeah, when it comes to oil, so let's separate oil from the traditional energy source. When it comes to oil, that's a transportation issue. I mean, that's you and your mom and your dad and the truckers and all the companies and the interstate highway systems. I mean, that's the big driver on oil. And I don't think now's not the time to go into the whole psychological issue of the preferences of Americans. The way to improve that is to get these technologies out and deployed and put them in attractive packages where people will buy them. And you can either force people to buy something, which I think, most people will say it's hard to do, to make people buy stuff, and there's a political will issue, or you give them very attractive products that they want to buy. We're seeing that. I'm actually quite encouraged with the level of interest that's now being shown as these fuel cell vehicles are being shown to be attractive. The advanced hybrids are now taking hold. Once those show up in the first SUVs, it's going to be a whole new ball game. Okay, so we're on the cusp of something very exciting from a marketing perspective. So I especially in the oil area where it's a matter of consumer preference, okay, and where consumers have control, you just have to attract them to do it. Now, on the private side of things, on the energy side of things, I believe we are at a very interesting point in our economic cycle. And I call it the fourth generation of productivity. The first generation was sort of getting labor more productive. The second generation was getting the equipment, the tools, the machinery, and all of that much more effective toward producing product with much greater rates and efficiencies. The third that we just went through is this information boom that helps us manage the labor and all of this new equipment, this new technology. Well, number 4 is coming. And number 4 is coming, and that's the place where it's generally been cheap. Energy is cheap in America. Most corporations in America, that's been the last thing they've tended to look at, unless they're highly energy intensive. It's the last thing they look at because it's a marginal cost. Well, now with international global competitiveness, labor's, with labor costs, all the heavy equipment, all this, that's their profit. I think, and I've had personal experience with this, it's that last 5 or 10% of productivity and profitability is in their energy bills. And what I've seen in the work I did doing environmental management system work is they're now looking there. And they're looking there in a very aggressive fashion in a way that I would say was not even there 10 years ago. Maybe it parallels right after the shocks, but then it went away because energy got cheap again. But now it's there because of profitability concerns. And I would hope to come back here 5 years from now and be talking to you and see that, in fact, this next generation has, in fact, taken hold. And you're seeing real individual company by company by company activity to go after energy efficiency in a way they didn't before. Why? Because it goes straight to the bottom line.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Over here.
Hi, my name is Julie Barrett, and I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. There must be a great deal of confidence in this voluntary registry program that is being put forth. And I wondered, what percentage of firms do you think are actually going to participate in this program? How are you going to incentivize them? I know there's a credit on the back end of it to participate, and how will you measure the success of this program going forward?
Let me just define registry. It's where you record emissions of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. Jim, what about the registry program?
Sitting here today, I couldn't predict the level of participation, but I'll tell you about the incentives to participate, which I think now that the policy's clear and the president's direction to basically, in industry, but also the transport sector and other sectors, that we have a target, okay, has created a much more explicit statement of, if we don't get on with it and meet what is a reasonable target, this administration philosophically would be committed to doing more. I think that's a key signal. The second signal is the fact that they'll get credit. So they know that by taking the action, that it's okay to take it now, rather than wait on the sidelines to see what the rules are going to be. We're telling, we'll protect you against the future rules if you go early. That's an added incentive. The third incentive is the fact that, as I'm talking about, I think this evolution's occurring in terms of where we are in terms of productivity. Companies are going to start doing it now, so why not participate in the scheme as well? It's the equivalent of the EPA, the incentives that were around the EPA 3350 program back in the early 90s, where basically it was pretty clear to industry that if they didn't finally step up, they were going to get regulated. And they did step up. They decided that they would take a 33% phase out of their toxics in a certain number of years, and then a 50% phase out in their toxics. That was an industry-agreed target. The government didn't impose it on. The industry agreed that's the one they would accept. And guess what happened? They did it. There was no regulation. There was no enforcement. In fact, they went beyond it. We're trying to create the same stage. I can't tell you what will happen, but we've made clear to the outside actors, now's the time to play, and if you don't play, you'll have to deal with the consequences.
Rosina, any comment?
Under the Energy Policy Act of '92, companies were encouraged to record what they were doing, and I guess 800 companies are saying they're engaged in like 1,800 projects, but all of that amounts to a very small hill of CO2. It's 30 million metric tons, and my great concern is that without, sort of a 3350 target or whatever, a lot of companies who are gearing up for the U.S. to be part of Kyoto and to be involved in this big international trading scheme may now just kind of lose interest and sit by the sidelines if it's voluntary.
All right, this is going to unfortunately be our last question. Jim has to get off to the airport to get a 8:25 flight back to Washington. We're very grateful he took the time to come. We're going to ask one more question, get a response, and then ask you all if you had anything you wanted to get off your chest before we wrap this up in terms of closing remarks. So let's go up here.
Hi, good evening. My name is John Kashishian. I'm a sophomore here at the college, and I'm currently taking Joe Aldi's Economics of Climate Change sophomore tutorial. And among the various abatement policies we've discussed are tradable emissions permits and/or carbon tax. And I was wondering if the Bush administration has considered these as part of its overall program.
Similar to, let me put it this way, carbon tax is not politically viable. The economists write about it. I understand it. It's an interesting academic discussion, but I have to live in the world of political reality. So that's on the carbon tax. Tradable, market-based systems support market-based systems. We've got the acid rain trading program. The president recently announced our Clear Skies program for pollutants. that was going to cut sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and mercury by 70% using a market-based cap and trade. So we're all for market-based type approaches. We don't think that the climate issue is ready for that yet. To go from a relatively small number of utilities for acid rain to a larger number of utilities with 3 pollutants of current consequence to Americans in terms of health and environmental degradation is an even greater challenge, and we're going to have a huge effort on the Hill to try to get that through. To expand that out economy-wide for carbon, just as a matter of good old-fashioned politics, but also as a matter of instrument design, we're not quite ready for that yet. But if we continue down this course, certainly that is the kind of approach that we would strongly favor, a market-based approach toward dealing with this issue.
Rosina, a quick comment on carbon taxes?
Carbon tax would be efficient, but it is politically impossible. I think economists in both administrations have promoted cap and trade.
Let me just ask Jim and then Rosina if they have anything they want to close with and leave in people's mind. And let me just comment as well that Jim has to run out the door to get in a cab. So despite the urge to grab him and buttonhole him on some issue that we didn't get to raise today, I ask you all to not do that and let him escape back to Washington and do his job. But any closing remarks, Jim?
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this forum. It is my first ivory tower foray since coming in, and I particularly like it because the discussions are so oriented on the policy, and it's the policy debate that has to happen. The politics have overcrowded some of these issues, and we need good, serious, sensible policy debate. So that's first off. Second, I just want to now quote Dr. Holdren. Now's the time to level the conversation. I was reading back in his congressional testimony, and he had indicated that he said, "I believe that seeking to reduce the energy intensity of economic activity by 2% per year on a worldwide century-long basis is a desirable target." That is the target that we've set. So I think there's a commonality in terms of if you had to approach this issue of climate change in a way where you can make some progress and actually get it through the political dynamic, this is a sensible way to go forward. But as the science dictates, and if this issue, as we go forward, we need the world to do it. If we can get the world to take a sensibly reasonable short-term target, then ratcheting it down is not nearly so difficult. To start the game, with the United States, Dean Bierbaum had indicated, what the differences are. What we were asked to do under Kyoto would be, notwithstanding our growth in population and our economic growth, we would have to cut 30% below where we are today. There's nothing we could do today that would achieve that. There's no political scenario under which that would occur. And so the real challenge is, can we set a positive forward path, get many actors participating in the process rather than politicizing the process? That's really what we're trying to achieve. And for better or worse, you can hate it, you can like it. It's really trying to get everybody marching down together. And I hope that will make some great success. I do want you to go read our policy on clear skies. If the only thing you know about clear skies is what the Boston papers are reporting, you don't know anything about clear skies. And what it means for this region in particular and your air quality and the guaranteed results that's going to mean for air quality, I think is important to all of you. So I hope I can come back sometime and talk to you about that, because that's about market-based cap and trade doing something really good.
Rosina, in exchange for the last word, I have to keep it brief.
Yes. I agree that learning by doing is very, very important, and I think we better get on then with the learning by doing for both adaptation and mitigation. And in defense of Dr. Holdren, if the whole world were to reduce by 2% a year, we would have to do way more than that, because the developing countries have to grow. They can't simply start reducing. So the 2% a year does not really equate to us doing 2% a year. We have a bigger job to do.
Well, please everyone join me in a warm thanks for our wonderful panelists.